Oh, maybe one thing we should do, a lot of the audience is not aware that Philip has, his position has evolved. They are still thinking in terms of the last discussion we had. So maybe it's good that already in the beginning, Philip explains what his views are now. Because I already read it, probably you already read it, Richard, but the audience has to catch up.
Yeah, sorry, I accidentally pressed live, so we are actually live.
Oh,
now.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, yeah, right when you said, "Oh, hold on," I had already hit the button, so sorry about that. But yeah, we'll definitely. I read the paper I was at his talk to where he presented this, then reworked it. So we'll definitely get to that. So let's go ahead and start. We are live. I guess that's what I normally say, but everyone already knows. So joining me today, two very special guests, Bernardo Kastrup and Philip Goff. I want to thank you guys for joining me. You've been on before. I love talking to you guys. It's always a pleasure discussing this stuff with you. Just in case there's anybody out there who doesn't know you guys, would you like to say a little bit about who you are and what you do? I assume you need no introduction, but you never know.
You're very kind, Richard. Go on, Bernardo, after you.
Bernardo Kastrup. I'm a philosopher and computer engineer. Still do a bit of both. And I'm heading now a new foundation around philosophy. It's not public yet. We don't have a website yet, but that's what I will be doing from now on.
Oh, that sounds interesting. I didn't know about
that.
You
said a new foundation.
Yes, Essentia Foundation. It's a new foundation focused on promoting certain philosophical views that currently are not mainstream, but we think they have every reason to be mainstream. So that's what we'll be working on. It's a well-funded initiative. I think we have a good chance. You should know more about it towards the end of the year, beginning next year.
Amazing. Very cool. I look forward to checking that out. All right.
Yeah, that sounds great. Look forward to hearing about that. I'm Philip Goff. I'm a philosopher at Durham University, mainly interested in consciousness, but questions about reality in general, how everything fits together, how you fit tricky things in. Morality, free will, maths, stuff like that.
The grand old tradition of metaphysics, asking
That's what it's
questions.
called, yeah. But yeah, if you say, sometimes people think metaphysics is sort of like spooky or something, like contacting the dead or something, but
yeah. Yeah, none of that. Well, I appreciate your guys' work, and even though we disagree about many things, I think it's these kinds of conversations are very important. And I assume that between you guys, most of the disagreement is mostly in-house fighting. You guys will probably agree more on than you disagree on. So maybe I don't know. Do you guys think that's accurate, or?
I think there are lots of points where we agree, especially now, having read the latest paper by Philip. But I wouldn't characterize it as in-house fighting. I think there are some issues that are pretty significant where we have disagreements. It's not negligible. The points where we disagree, I don't think they are insignificant.
I see.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was joked on Twitter that it might be like this, the scene in Life of Brian where there's this big fight between the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front that, I guess we both think the fundamental thing is a conscious mind. And so, that is a point of similarity. But yeah, there are important differences. And
okay, well, definitely I'm the odd man out. As you know me, I'm a friend to serious thinking about hard issues, although my heart lies with physicalism. I'm not here to defend that. I'm more interested in trying to understand your dispute between you guys and what we can try to make some progress, hopefully, on this debate. And one of the things that Bernardo was just talking about at the beginning, I think it's a good place to start, actually, because he was mentioning the way that, Philip, you've changed your view recently. Mm-hmm. I guess and I've always been a little bit unclear myself, to be honest, about the relationship between panpsychism and cosmopsychism. You talk sometimes as though panpsychism is like a version of cosmopsychism or vice versa. So I wonder if you could just say what your view has evolved to, as Bernardo suggested would be good, and then maybe give us a little bit of the relationship between that and panpsychism generally.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's changed. I'm not sure this new view is since me and Bernardo last discussed, actually. I'm not sure. But I guess it's the last year or so, maybe. Yeah, so I guess in terms of cosmopsychism and panpsychism, I guess I take those to be, well, I guess the way I define things, these is just how you use words. I think of panpsychism as covering both a micropsychist version where the basic things are at the micro level, the basic conscious entities at the micro level, or cosmopsychism where the basic conscious entity is the universe. I think of them as both forms of panpsychism. And if I think the difference between me and Bernardo perhaps is that I think that the fundamental conscious mind is the universe, whereas he thinks, it underlies in some sense the physical universe. But anyway, maybe we get onto that. But I mean, I think the thing that's changed. So I've always been open to both micropsychism and cosmopsychism. I guess you tend to talk in terms of micropsychism because it's sort of simpler in some sense. But I've always been open to it. But then my new view, I guess, it is a form of cosmopsychism. But the idea, well, maybe if I could just start with what I think a theory of consciousness has to achieve. So I think a theory of consciousness has to satisfy two constraints that I call an internal constraint and an external constraint. So the external constraint is just to fit the empirical data, and the internal constraint is to get rid of explanatory gaps. So I think it's easy to do one of these, but the trick is to do both. So I think, dualism is easily, like David Chalmers style dualism, easily gets around the explanatory gap just by postulating fundamental laws of nature that bridge the gap between the physical and the mental. I think that's a perfectly fine explanation. But then it gets into trouble with the external constraint because the neuroscience doesn't seem to show evidence of the impact of non-physical properties in the brain. So it's got a sort of tension with the empirical data. Whereas physicalism, the other way around, I think it does fine with the matching the empirical data, but it seems to have this huge explanatory gap between the purely quantitative properties of physical science and the qualitative properties of consciousness. So the trick is to match both. And I think panpsychism has trouble in this regard as well. So basically, there's a big division in panpsychism between strong and weak emergentists. So strong emergentists postulate fundamental laws of nature to bridge the gap between fundamental kinds of consciousness and emergent kinds of consciousness. So you might just have a basic law of nature that when conscious particles are combined in a certain kind of way, you get a consciousness associated with the system as a whole. Whereas weak emergentists try to do the job without recourse to these special laws of nature. They just, they might just say, just when you've got conscious particles arranged in a certain way, you've got a conscious brain or something. What people have argued in the recent literature is that strong emergentism has all the problems of dualism and weak emergentism has all the problems of physicalism. So strong emergentism has the problems of dualism because we don't seem to see in neuroscience any evidence of these strongly emergent properties. Weak emergentism has the problems of physicalism because there seems to be an explanatory gap, say, between facts about conscious particles and facts about a conscious brain or conscious system. So what I've been exploring, this is really the innovation. I've gone back and forward with cosmopsychism. My first book in 2017 was Cosmopsychist. But the new innovation is a sort of hybrid view where we're strong emergentists about subjects of experience, but weak emergentists about their phenomenal properties. So there's just basic laws of nature that ensure in certain circumstances, new subjects of experience emerge. But these new subjects of experience don't come with their own brand new forms of consciousness. They, as it were, inherit streams of consciousness that already exist at the fundamental level. And I'm conceiving of this in cosmopsychist terms. So you've got, the universe having these streams of consciousness. And when emergent subjects appear, they inherit streams of consciousness from the fundamental level. So this is supposed to satisfy, sorry, going on a little bit, nearly finished. This is supposed to satisfy the internal constraint, get rid of explanatory gaps, because it just postulates basic laws of nature to ensure the existence of these emergent subjects and that they inherit the right streams of consciousness. And it would be an empirical question what those basic laws are. So you solve the explanatory gap in the way the dualist like David Chalmers does, but satisfy the external constraint because, basically this view can accommodate quite easily the fact that systems involving emergent subjects behave pretty much the same as systems not involving emergent subjects, which is what we seem to see empirically. That's, you know, that's the tricky thing for the dualist or the strong emergentist panpsychist. But because these emergent subjects are just inheriting, you know, the properties of fundamental physics, the properties fundamental physics tracks, that's quite explicable that they're not going to behave very much differently. So yeah, so that's the view I've been defending. Does that make sense?
I mean, so I don't know if Bernardo wants to jump in here and say anything, but I mean,
my view has been stable for a while. So if the audience knows it, it is what I have always put forward. I think the basis of reality, there is one spatially unbound field of phenomenality or universal consciousness, if you want to call it. I think living beings are dissociated alters of this universal consciousness, and physical bodies that metabolize are the appearance of these alters, are the way these alters present themselves to observation on the screen of perception. And I think we can make sense of everything in terms of patterns of excitation of this one spatially unbound field. We can make sense of our individual experiences, of our shared experiences, of the laws of physics, of everything based solely on excitations of this underlying field.
So what's not clear to me at this stage is whether, Philip, you're going to count a view like Bernardo's as a version of panpsychism. I mean, given the way you so broadly define the term, is this a panpsychist view on your account?
Well,
or?
I mean, this is one of the things I wanted to talk about, really. I suppose, as I think of the difference. The difference is that I think so we both think there's a conscious mind at the fundamental basis of reality, but I would say it is the physical universe, whereas I think Bernardo say, maybe I'm saying it not quite right, it underlies the physical universe, or the physical universe is not, anyway, it's not identical with the physical universe. It's the physical universe is how it presents or something. Yeah, so I suppose, I mean, I'm not sure whether, I want to ask Bernardo why he goes his way rather than my way. I'm very curious. I'm not sure, although I'm not sure what my answer would be. I guess I think of my position as the sort of default position, but I can see ways you could think Bernardo's position is the default as well. And then I also wonder whether they are two different ways of just saying the same thing. You know, that might turn out to be the case. I don't know.
That's I was about to say just that. From my perspective, these are two different ways of saying the same thing. The division, the separation I'm making is very traditional in Western philosophy. It goes back to Kant. It's the separation between phenomena and noumena, between representation and the thing in itself, between the contents of the screen of perception and the world as it is in itself, independent of observation. So I think, yeah, there is a world out there. It presents itself to us along the lines that we have called matter, things that we can measure. Actually, matter is even a description of what appears on the screen of perception. It's not the screen of perception in itself, but there is a way the world appears to us. And what is missing is what is the world in and of itself, independently of how it appears to an individual subject looking at it. That is then the essence of the world. I would say the essence of the world is phenomenal, experiential. These are transpersonal, endogenous experiences, but they are qualitatively different from what appears on the screen of perception. The way the world presents itself to us is different from the way the world feels from a first-person perspective. And the reason for that difference is, one, there is a boundary, there is a dissociative boundary that explains why there are individual subjects with seemingly private conscious inner life. And evolution, the way we evolved as organisms, have imposed certain processing of how the world impinges on us, such that we would have a higher survival advantage. And that's encoded in our cognitive processes associated with perception. The way I see the world is different from the way a bee sees the world. The screen of perception of a bee will have contents that are qualitatively very different from what appears on the screen of my perception. And the world as it is in itself is neither because it's not being modulated by cognitive processes that have evolved over time. It has a first-person perspective. It is endogenous. I think it would be mostly the best way to visualize it from an anthropocentric perspective would be to think of it as a sort of a universal thought or a universal feeling that appears to us as objects moving about in space-time with color, weight, that can be described according to the quantities of physics. So I would say the world as it is in itself is consciousness. And it appears to us in a different way, but that too is consciousness, because what are the contents of the screen of perception but conscious experiences of the observing individual subject? So in both cases, there is only universal consciousness, but we can talk about it from these two perspectives.
Yeah, I'm happy with it. I guess I'm happy with a lot of that. I suppose it's just, I guess I'm sort of defending an indirect perception view. So some philosophers think, naive realists think we directly perceive the world. We're in direct perceptual content. We both deny that, but I suppose I want to say I can still say I perceive the physical universe indirectly, by having a state that represents an entity out there, and so I can say the physical, the fundamental mind is this thing I can perceive.
It is, insofar as the image of a process only exists by virtue of the process existing. The world you see around you is consciousness. I can say that coherently under analytic idealism. I can say the physical world is consciousness.
Okay.
But it is consciousness by being the thing that underlies the representations of the world in my individual mind. So in that sense, it also underlies the physical world. If I call the physical world the representation in my mind, then the world out there is not the physical world, because the physical world is a representation in my individual mind. But it would still underlie the physical world in the sense that it is that which is represented in my mind through color, shape, melody, and all that. So it underlies the physical world if the physical world is a representation in my mind, and it is the physical world insofar as you can say that the physical world is really out there. It's a language thing, it's how do you define the terms.
And would you, so if we're saying that this is just a view that could be described in panpsychist terms, insofar as you say it's the physical thing out there, or in idealist terms, insofar as you're thinking of the physical thing as what is the representation in your mind. I mean, would you say, could we say the same about the particle type panpsychism? Could we say, well, in a sense, this is idealism too, because the consciousness of the particles, in the same sense, I think it seems to me that it's the same in both. I mean, I don't want to get too hung up about this, and maybe we shouldn't waste too much time on it. Yeah, I'm happy with everything Bernardo said, I think, but it seems like we should say the same thing either way. I'm inclined to say the physical, it's the physical unit, the conscious thing is the physical universe, but I can see a sense in which you could say, no, it underlies the physical universe. But it seems to me exactly the same with conscious particles. We could say that it's the particles that are conscious, or we could say the consciousness sort of underlies the particle. I don't know.
I'm happy with that too. I would say that more recently in physics, we've come to a point, I mean, look at the work of physicists like Marcus Miller, who has impressed me. He has just won the TQXI essay prize, one of the most important.
I saw you tweeted that actually.
Yeah. So if you look at what physics is saying recently, it's basically an admission that physical realism is gone. You have to postulate an infinitude of parallel universes emerging every fraction of a femtosecond to still postulate some kind of physical realism. So for serious physicists not publicly committed to a certain position, it's basically a done deal now. So it's difficult to say that the physical world as described in terms of objects with defined properties is really what's out there. I think that view is refuted now. So there is something out there, obviously, but the physical world arises from a measurement. In other words, from an observation of that thing that is out there. And it is the way that thing presents itself to us upon measurement. But what is really out there is not constituted of objects with defined properties. So that's what motivates me to say what is out there underlies my perceptions. And the physical world is my perceptions and the perceptions of others as well.
So I mean, it sounds like this is a largely terminological issue, because what I'm hearing Bernardo saying is that, so, you know, one way of getting at this difference maybe is to rewind the clock back before there were living organisms. So, you know, 5 billion years ago, there was no Earth, and, you know, let's suppose there are no other planets with living organisms. Maybe that's a far-fetched, I don't know. But anyway, so we could find some time in the universe's history when there was no life. So at that point, there's a universe nonetheless, right? And there's according to both of you, a conscious subject, a center of experiences, and that's the thing which underlies our experience. It is the physical universe, is the way I'm hearing Bernardo say it. It is the physical universe, but the language of it underlying comes in when there are once there are perceivers. So
and if you want to differentiate the physical universe from the thing that is objectively out there, then it isn't the physical universe. But if you conflate the two, then you can say it is the physical universe. Yeah.
Do the laws of physics, I mean, here's one way in which you could get at the difference between idealism and panpsychism. So I've been talking to Donald Hoffman a lot recently, and I mean, so I think, you know, that physics gets the true fundamental structure of the universe, of fundamental reality, whereas I think Donald Hoffman thinks there's some to be discovered mathematical structure underlying physics. There's going to be a deeper story that's going to involve conscious agents, as he calls them. So that's a sense in which you can really see that it's a very clear sense in which there's something underlying the physical universe, in the sense that there's a deeper structural story in physics. But do you think, Bernardo, that the laws of physics completely describe the behavior of fundamental universal consciousness? I mean,
I don't think a physicist, a serious physicist, would even claim that it completely describes the behavior of the world, because we know that there are gaps in today's physics. We know that the laws that apply at the micro level contradict the laws that certainly apply at the macro level, and we have to find a way to reconcile them. And the way to do that is to dig deeper, is to go to ever more fundamental levels in physics. So the narrative you just explained, it is the narrative of physics, of ever digging deeper into their underlying patterns. But I think physics is accurate insofar as what we can reason about and empirically measure today. I don't think physics is an illusion. I think it accurately describes the physical world. In other words, the representations on the screen of perception, even when you use instrumentation in physics, like a telescope or microscope, those are only useful insofar as you perceive their outputs. I think physics is the best we can currently do to describe the behavior of the perceived universe.
Well, this might be a difference then, because you seem to be one of saying it's concerned with, you know, the representation on minds. But I suppose I'm inclined to think physics is on its way to giving the complete causal structure of the fundamental conscious mind. I mean, it's not the physicists. Physicists aren't aware that that's what they're doing. They're just, you know, they're just focusing on, you know, they're just thinking, look, there's this thing, and we trying to capture its mathematical structure. But I want to say they're on their way to capturing the mathematical structure of that reality as it is in and of itself. Not obviously they're not there yet. There's a lot, you know, there's a lot of problems making quantum mechanics.
But
they're on. So that's a real sense in which it's closer to materialism. It's you know, physics capturing the causal is on its way to capturing the causal structure of reality.
So can I just I don't want to interrupt anyone, but I guess I just did. So sorry. But so Philip, so it sounds like you're denying what Bernardo was saying about basically quantum mechanics, as I understand it, because you're saying that there is some way that the universe is that goes beyond what we can say about it in quantum mechanical terms. Whereas I think the point that Bernardo was trying to make is that we have pretty good reasons to deny that from quantum mechanics itself, that there is no, I know you're a fan of relational quantum mechanics. I'm not a huge fan of that, but, you know, anyway, some version of Copenhagen interpretation says, you know, there just aren't these properties out there. There is no way the universe is until it's measured. Sounds like you're denying that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose I wouldn't be attracted to the straightforward Copenhagen interpretation. I mean, I guess I'm a fan of the Bohmian view, which gets rid of all that crap. But even if you have say the many worlds view, or a collapse view where you have the wave function is the fundamental thing, then the wave function is determinate. Okay, I mean, states of the wave function correspond to indeterminate. I mean, yeah, even if you have the Copenhagen view, I think still, insofar as we're thinking of we could think of the wave function as the thing that's out there in and of itself, and it has determinate states. Those determinate states of the wave function correspond to, what we think of as indeterminate locations of particles and so on. But it's determinate states but they correspond to determinate states of the wave function. So even on the Copenhagen interpretation, I think you can think there is a determinate way reality is in and of itself. It's just not determinate particles and determinate observables.
But even the wave function, although you can describe it, it's basically a wave of probabilities. There is very little. And there has been, I mean, this is an argument in physics. The discussion you're bringing forward is the dispute between people who think the wave function is ontic and those who think the wave function is epistemic. In other words, are we describing our best knowledge of the world, or is that thing something that exists objectively as a wave? If you look at how the wave function is derived, it's hard to say that it's objective, because it's a probabilistic equation. It gives us a sense of what might happen next. So you could say, well, but those probabilities exist objectively. It's an open question. It gets difficult, but it is a question that can be debated within the constraints of physics itself. In other words, there are approaches to this that are physically incoherent, and therefore should be discarded on a physical basis, not only a philosophical basis. I tend to think of the wave function as an epistemic thing. It captures the best we can know about the world. I do think there is an objective world out there which presents itself to us upon measurement in a certain way that we call a physical world of objects with defined properties. And I think physics can describe the regularities, the patterns and regularities of this representation quite accurately. I mean, it's not even an opinion, right? This is an empirical fact. We can describe those regularities very accurately. And in doing so, I do think physics is telling us a lot about the world that underlies the representation. In other words, about that which is represented. Because if the representation is an image of that thing, then by capturing the regularities of the image, we are accumulating knowledge about that thing, because the image correlates with it. It's an image of it. It may be distorted, it may be incomplete, but if we know the image well, then there is something we know about what underlies the image, because it's an image of it. So I do think that what physics is telling us is phenomenal, and it has never had as many philosophical implications that it has now over the past decade or so. And despite that, I think it's very useful in and of itself. Physics in and of itself is useful and is informing us something valuable about the underlying natures of reality, despite its limitations.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I can see how, certain ways of understanding quantum mechanics might fit better with a kind of idealist view than, and I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I guess.
So my question here is kind of what you were just bringing up there, Philip. I wonder if it goes one way, excuse me, if it goes one way versus another with respect to the way we should understand quantum mechanics, is that going to cut against one of these views? Like, for example, if Bohmian, I don't even like saying that word, but if some interpretation like that turns out to be correct, that seems to favor you. Some version of relational cubism, Copenhagen, something like that seems to favor Bernardo. Well, is that a way to settle this dispute, or is there still going to be some left over?
I'm not sure this is so much of a dispute. To me, this is not where the important things lie, I don't think. I mean, what I'm interested, what I want of a theory of consciousness, talked about, getting rid of the explanatory gaps and what was the other thing? Fitting the empirical data, so
it's your theory, Philip.
I described a view, that I think you could interpret in idealist or cosmopsychist terms, and I'm not too bothered about that. That's not really where my energies are focused. So yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, in a way, it's not really a dispute, I feel, particularly. But yeah, I think it could somewhat depend on interpretations of quantum mechanics, which way you go on that.
I mean, to me, that's interesting because it suggests an empirical edge to this discussion, which is what I am interested in.
Philosophy has a knack for going around empirical limitations. I think analytic idealism could still be, I think it would still be the most tenable, plausible alternative, even if the world were entirely classical, because then I would say those definite states of the world out there are the representation of transpersonal experiential states. So a classical world in which quantum mechanics never existed and doesn't need to exist, I think would still be best explained in ontological terms through analytic idealism. Now, it is, of course, a fact that quantum mechanics raises empirical problems for physicalism. At least for the naive realist view of many physicalists out there. So that plays in our favor, mine and Philip's, by excluding certain alternative ontologies. But I think both analytic idealism and Philip's new hybrid cosmopsychism, hybrid cosmopsychism. There are ways to make even Philip's new cosmopsychism into a classical view of the world. Oh, certainly. And for analytic idealism, that holds as well.
Right. But I mean, so I guess I would push back on the claim about physicalism, but I certainly agree that naive versions of physicalism that take the world to be classical are brought into question by this. But still, so, I mean, because I thought that part of the argument for, maybe it's just an ancillary argument in your view, Bernardo, but I thought that part of the argument for idealism relied on interpreting quantum mechanics, or that was part of the evidence that you gave for why we should accept a view.
Yeah. I don't think, look, I would feel a lot more comfortable with the Bohmian mechanics too. It would satisfy, it would close the story in my mind much better than what we have to deal with right now. And analytic idealism would be perfectly consistent with a fully classical world. It would just say that the essence of the world out there is experiential. And matter is the way that experience presents itself from across a dissociative boundary. So everything would still hold. The advantage for analytic idealism of quantum mechanics is that it's differentiating for naive physicalism. In other words, it refutes naive physicalism, and then it can be construed as positive evidence for analytic idealism because it doesn't refute the latter. This differentiation is an empirical case for analytic idealism, but the reverse doesn't work in the sense that you wouldn't exclude analytical idealism if quantum mechanics were not true. It would still hold, but it would be less easy.
You just wouldn't have the evidence for it, though.
Yes, differentiating evidence.
I'm just thinking now, bringing in the quantum mechanics, do you think, and if the wave function is kind of epistemic, does that mean we can't get a grip on reality as it is in and of itself?
I will repeat the words of Marcus Miller, who is my new favorite physicist. What he says is he would answer this question in the negative. No, we cannot get a grip on reality as it is in and of itself, which shouldn't be surprising. Why would primates evolved on a peripheral planetary system of a typical galaxy have the cognitive apparatus to unveil the inner structure of reality itself? But what he would say is that we can know everything that there is to be known. And if it turns out that what there is to be known are probabilities, then we can know those. And that's already a great advancement.
Okay, so I still aspire, I think, and maybe this is partly my attraction to the the Bohemian view, or some kind of hidden variables. Lee Smolin, who I talked to, got a bit, has his own kind of hidden variables view in which time is real but not space. So I suppose what I'm still aspiring to, you know, a view where we can say, look, this is reality as it is in itself. We've got it. And so what I worry about with, for example, to give a vivid example, the Bohmian view I don't like, where you just have the wave function and one single particle. And the wave function is understood as a very high dimensional kind of possibility space. And then each location in that space corresponds to what we think of as a global arrangement of all the particles in the universe. So all that matters is where that one particle is. So on this view, that is reality, is just this high dimensional space and this one particle. And if that was the whole of reality, the fundamental structure, I don't think you would have consciousness. You know, my consciousness has a rich sort of temporal structure that just doesn't fit into that kind of ontology. And I worry whether, you know, some of these, again, you know, the views where we don't have space and time at the fundamental level are the same. So I do think it maybe if we want a theory of reality where we can explain, account for consciousness and satisfy those two constraints I was talking about, and completely understand what's going on, then maybe we do need something more like a hidden variables view. Then we can accommodate consciousness into the physical world. So I don't know. So maybe I know that's going against the trend of certain prominent theoretical physicists. So maybe these are just different bets on how things are going to go. And it is interesting, as Richard says, how, you know, how this connects with the physics. So, you know, and it's good to have people placing different bets. So I guess I want to place a bet on, you know, I mean, so you might say, oh, how can I go against what these leading theoretical physicists are doing? But I don't think they give a shit about consciousness. I mean, I just don't think that's what they're not taking it as a constraint that we need to find a place for consciousness in reality. I think, you know, Galileo said, just do the maths and forget about consciousness, and it's long forgotten. So I wonder, but it's I mean, I would just to finish off I mean, I'm not you know, as it's above my pay grade to assess some of these considerations, but I wonder how, to these theoretical physicists, things would look if, I mean, like Lee Smolin is doing. Lee Smolin is partly motivated by the need to accommodate consciousness. I wonder whether the theories you're attracted to would look very different. So I still hope for, you know, if we could have some kind of hidden variables, and then we could still accommodate consciousness and have a theory of reality where we completely get what's going on. Sorry, Richard, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no big deal. I'd rather hear what you had to say. But I mean, so to me, this is sort of symptomatic of a larger issue, which is this kind of pining away for the classical world to come back. So people like me think, you know, that's just gone. You got to give up on it. So all of this tinkering, you know, Gerhard Reiner, all of this physical collapse, hidden variables, all of that is just symptomatic of a pining for a bygone era when there were classical properties out there with determinate values, and it just quantum mechanics seems to say just let go of that. I mean, there's some question about the math on hidden variable stuff, whether you can actually reproduce some of the predictions. It gets quite subtle, but the math, it's not clear 100% that it reproduces the exact same theory of quantum mechanics. The cleanest, most simplest version of it is just rejecting all that stuff. So I mean, certainly consciousness is important. I take consciousness just as seriously as you guys, I hope, as you guys do, I hope. But if this pining away for the classical world, we should let go of it. I mean, it's just 17th century is gone. We're here in the 21st century, and we're not going back.
Can I just say something in response? Oh, sorry, go on. I just, because I guess sorry to interrupt Bernardo, but I guess I'm the opponent there. Just it's not pining for a classical world for the sake of it. It's pining for a theory of reality we can completely understand the nature of. And yeah, if you're a physicalist and real reductionist about consciousness, then this is not a problem. You can probably reduce consciousness to it. And I guess a lot of these theoretical physicists just have some materialist picture in the background. And yeah, then it's not a problem. I'm not intrinsically bothered about quantum indeterminacy or whatever. It's just, I think if you do think human consciousness is in some sense irreducible, then it's a challenge how it could be incorporated into those weirder kind of quantum worlds. And then okay, so we could have some kind of what I call a Mysterian view, where okay, we're relating to reality as in and of itself, but we can't really penetrate it. It seems maybe Bernardo's going that way, but okay, I mean, that might be where we have to end up, but I don't think it's just nostalgia to yearn to try and get a complete theory of reality. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I think, look, we shouldn't make our philosophical debate contingent on an obscure issue of foundations of physics. So I'm perfectly comfortable to go ahead today by granting that at the end, some global hidden variables theory will win. And then mystery is gone. It's just some states of the world out there, and then you will be happy, Philip. And I'm perfectly comfortable debating under that assumption for the sake of the exercise. I'm not ignoring the empirical part of it, but for the sake of the exercise, I would concede that. So we can continue to talk without referring to things that we have no control over. The only thing I would add, and then I'll stop talking about this mysterious quantum things, is that there are physicists today who are surprisingly enough, adopting a constructivist view of the objective world, which flirts with solipsism, but they have run their equations. And what it turns out to be the case is that if the world that we perceive is actually constructed by us through inferential steps, and we know perception is inferential. We know even that is a necessary, is a necessity in principle. Carl Friston has demonstrated that. Otherwise, we would dissolve into an entropic soup if perception weren't inferential. So what these physicists have done is they have run models in which the physical world is constructed by inference, by induction, and then it turns out that if that were the case, the result would be exactly what we observe today. We all think we are inhabiting the same world with objective patterns and regularities of behavior that would emerge by itself as a product of this construction by induction, inferential induction. But okay, I'll leave it at that today. And then we can say, okay, suppose global hidden variables will win. So the world has a definite state. and we will say that state is physical. I'm happy to continue the discussion under that assumption.
Yeah, and just to say concessionary, but I can see how these views of quantum mechanics lend support to idealism and fit well with idealism. And just one quick thing on Richard's point, and then let's move on to other issues on whether the maths. I mean, there are people who claim to be able to make Bohmianism fit with quantum field theory and relativistic, but there are issues here. The impression I've got talking to Lee Smolin is that people haven't been that bothered on working on that. I mean, they're just, why would you be bothered? He's bothered, I guess, partly because of philosophical motivations, that he thinks time is real on philosophical grounds. But so unless you have some kind of need to sort of accommodate fundamental consciousness, so I wonder whether, I think he was saying about the certain tricky infinities that, maybe no one's kind of got the Bohmian theory round. So I wonder whether it could be, I just, I just think we don't as a scientific community in general take consciousness seriously. I mean, I guess, I wonder if there was less of a materialist dominance and people, more people took consciousness as sort of fundamental, whether that would impact on how theoretical physicists think. But anyway,
yeah,
I think
I'm a little skeptical appealing to, no offense to Lee, but some people consider him less than reputable. I guess I'd say, to put it nicely.
I am not one of them, for the record.
I am. I think he verges on a crackpot. But anyway, okay. So let's, there's something that I think, maybe before we get off of the fundamental physics stuff, I have one question, which is about the M theory stuff and string theory. And in particular, the implication. So I sort of know what both of your guys' views are here. I think you guys are both sort of against it, maybe. But in particular, the implications of the multiverse, the swampland, the landscape, as they call it, et cetera, all of that sort of stuff. So I think that you guys are both skeptics with respect to the multiverse. But suppose, for an instance, that we had good reasons to accept it. For instance, I think we do. Then would that impact your view? Because, for example, on cosmopsychism, you postulate there's one fundamental entity, the subject. But in the multiverse, there'd be many of them. And I think something might be true on, if the multiverse were real on Bernardo's view as well, that that maybe there'd be multiple subjects, or maybe that what we call the universe is itself a dissociated alter from the. So I just wonder if you guys have thought about this, or if you just think it's not worth thinking about because of the state of string theory currently. So I'm just curious about your response to this, since we're on the topic of fundamental physics.
What do you think, Bernardo?
I am sympathetic to the idea of a multiverse. I suspect there are parallel universes, but not for the reason that, for instance, Sean Carroll puts it forward. There are 4 reasons for postulating multiverses in physics today, and they are completely different. One of them is just to say if space-time is infinite, then there is a limited number of combinations of states that can exist. And in that infinitude of space-time, that combination is bound to occur again. So there would be a parallel universe in which you and I, Philip, are having this discussion, but it's just beyond the horizon of space-time. So like this, there are several different reasons for postulating a multiverse. One of them is to salvage physical realism from the clutches of experimental evidence. And that's the reason Sean Carroll puts it forward. I think that reason is not only wrong, it is laughable, almost. It is the most implausible, unlikely thing one could come up with while still being consistent with the equations of physics. So I don't think there are parallel universes being created at every fraction of a femtosecond in which everything that could possibly happen actually does happen. And that thing is branching out into an infinitude of branches within a fraction of a second. I think that's outright crazy. But I do think there might be parallel dreams in the universal mind. Other thoughtscapes or experiential fields in which physics is different, in which logic is different. There is nothing holy about Aristotelian logic, by the way. It doesn't matter how intuitive it is. Even humans have come up with alternatives like intuitionism and other things.
Right.
Do I think that can be the case? I think that can be the case, but not for the reason that parallel universes are put forward today by the likes of Sean Carroll.
So, but for just a jump, sorry, but so there's 2 things that you might be criticizing Sean for. So one, maybe the many worlds interpretation, but yeah. 2, the more standard, like the argument from inflation. So the mathematics of inflation suggests once it starts, it's going to keep going, which is one of the reasons for postulating the multiverse. Do you take that line of reasoning serious?
I take that as plausible. Yeah. So thanks for that, Richard. I'm rejecting only the first thing you mentioned. I think there are other plausible reasons for thinking of multiple universes. One of them has to do with the fine tuning, which is a subject close to Philip's heart. There is an idea that universes collapse. That at the other side of black holes, there are whole universes emerging in which the laws of physics are, the constants at least, are shaken up and they can acquire different values. And then there is an evolutionary theory of how the physical quantities came to be so fine-tuned because they would have been favored in this cycle of universes emerging out of black holes in other universes. So it's kind of crazy, it's far out, but it's not incoherent. And, right. and although they are implausible, the problems we are dealing with today require implausible answers because nothing that is plausible solves them. So I'm open to all that. I'm even open to M theory, which I think is beautiful. I think it's mathematical philosophy, not physics, because it doesn't have enough empirical grounding, but I'm in love with it. And I think ultimately we will find out that the hyperdimensional brain underlying all existence is universal consciousness. And then we would marry ontology with M theory. The only thing I reject is the many worlds interpretation.
So then, just before we get Philip's take on this, so then it is your view then that the fundamental subject is a unified thing, and that these many universes would be parallel streams or dreams or other alters, or what's the terminology, the right way to characterize the relationship of the multiverses to the mind?
If they are dissociated from each other cognitively, then you could call them alters. If you want to stick with the terminology of M theory, they are different brains, different cross sections of that hyperdimensional object that is at the root of everything. And if they are that, then our universe is a certain brain, which could conceivably even collapse with another. There are some ideas that that's how our universe started, from the collapse, from the contact between I said collapse, but what I mean is contact, hitting upon another brain and having given rise to ours. So under that scenario, I would say that what universal consciousness is the hyperdimensional brain of which cross sections are seemingly separate universes.
What's your take on this, Philip?
Yeah, so on the quantum mechanical many worlds, I can see the case for it. I don't think I agree with Bernardo that it's just some desperate attempt. It's very popular. I'm just saying anecdotally, talking to philosophers of physics, among philosophers of physics, I think because you just have the Schrödinger equation, you don't have collapse, and also because what's it called? Decoherence alone, as I understand it, can explain the two-split experiment. So then collapse sort of seems redundant. So I think a lot of philosophers say, look, it's just the simplest interpretation of quantum mechanics. I can see the force of that. Two worries I have with it, though. One, the familiar probability worries. How do you make sense of probabilities if kind of everything happens? But I haven't really thought about that very much. But also my worry about it, and I have a paper on this in this forthcoming volume on quantum mechanics and consciousness. If I just don't think if you're so I mean, what a lot of lay people miss is that the worlds aren't fundamental, right? They're what is fundamental is the wave function, which some people understand as this very high dimensional space that's sort of a possibility space relative to what we think of the physical world. So people like Sean Carroll say, well, the physical world is like tables and chairs are emergent. But what they mean by that is just that there's a kind of mathematical mapping. So I don't think actually, I don't think the structure of the wave function could accommodate the structure of human consciousness. And I think my human consciousness has a sort of concrete reality that we couldn't just account for its existence via a mathematical mapping to the fundamental physical story. So my worry is on the many worlds interpretation, you can't accommodate consciousness in there on the kind of panpsychist picture I would aspire to. So that's what I think about that. On the inflationary model. So yeah, I mean, look, it's I'm not don't have the expertise to assess the empirical reasons to accept eternal inflation. But as I understand it, there's nothing in the physics. There's no empirical ground for thinking these different bubble universes have different values of their parameters. There's just no empirical grounds for thinking that. String theory opens up the possibility because you think of just how the strings vibrate could make the constants different, but there's no empirical reason for thinking that is the case. I think, and I'm open for correction on this, what people are doing is looking at the fine tuning, the fact that all the constants in the universe we can observe are exactly as they need for life to be possible. And they're saying, okay, well, we already believe in eternal inflation. Maybe if there's some kind of random process when a new bubble starts that makes the strings vibrate differently and get different constants, that would remove the mystery of the fine tuning. I think that's what they're doing. And if that's what they are doing, I think there's a logical fallacy there. So this is what's called the inverted gambler's fallacy, and this has been in the philosophical literature for 20 years. Ian Hacking or Hacking came up with it, but then a famous paper with Roger White from the year 2000. But, you know, philosophers don't reach out enough. It's just in these technical Bayesian papers. But, you know, so the basic idea, and this is what I would like to write more about, both at a popular level and an academic level. So, you know, the basic argument is, you know, so the gambler's fallacy is where you've been playing cards all night and you've got really bad hands, and you think, oh, well, I'm really likely, because I've had such a bad run of luck, I'm really likely to have a good run of luck now. And obviously that's a fallacy, because how likely your next hand of cards will be is not dependent on what's gone before.
On the history,
yeah. The inverted gambler's fallacy. So it's Hacking gave the example. You know, you go into a casino and you see someone with just been given a really good hand of cards, and you think, oh, they must have been playing all night, because, you know, if they've been playing lots of times, it'll make it more likely that. But it won't, because all you've observed is one hand, and whatever happened before doesn't make it any more likely that that hand is going to come out good. So that's the inverted gambler's fallacy. And Roger White has argued, you know, quite influentially amongst academic philosophers, it hasn't really got out further, that the multiverse, the inference from fine tuning to a multiverse commits that fallacy. So we sort of think, you know, all we've observed is our universe. That's what we need explained, why our universe is fine tuned. So you say, oh, there must be all these other universes. But, you know, no matter how many other universes are, it doesn't make it any more likely that our universe is fine-tuned. You know, that's what we need explaining. Just, I mean, another analogy I thought might be more vivid. If you wake up, you've had amnesia, and you don't know where you are or how you got there, and there's just a monkey on a typewriter typing perfect English, you'd say, wow, that needs explaining. You know, maybe it's a trained monkey, maybe it's a trick. Say you're in, sorry, I forgot. Say you're in a sort of a room in an apartment block. What you wouldn't say is, oh, there must be lots of other monkeys with typewriters in the other rooms in this building writing nonsense, because that would make it more likely that this monkey's right. Because what you need explaining is why this monkey is typing English, and the postulation of other monkeys and help that. So people say that the multiverse theory is committing that logical fallacy. And now a lot of people say, I've nearly finished. A lot of people say, what about the selection effect? But White's got quite persuasive reasons to think the selection effect doesn't make a difference with this.
I mean, I guess I think that's a little unfair, because there are really two prongs, as I understand the argument here. So one is inflation, which suggests multiverse possibility. I mean, there's only one universe, but then there are these bubbles where the laws, where we can't communicate, or there's no, like, you know, way of transfer of information back and forth. Then the other prong is the landscape, which is that M theory, string theory predicts that there are all of these different fundamental constants, that they vary, so that
does it give us reason to think that? It doesn't give us reason to think, I mean, it allows that they're actually instantiated, does it?
But if it's random at root, then you would expect the throw of the dice would produce different constants. And there's a lot of evidence that in foundations of physics, that stuff is really random at that level.
Right, exactly. So it's those two things kind of combined, which lend credence to the idea that there are different laws in the different universes. Of course, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that. So the idea is that there'd be many universes where the laws are similar to ours, but also ones in which they differ. And so string theory gives us some reason to expect that. And inflation gives us some reason to expect that it might be instantiated. And those two together function as a reason to think that the fine tuning is explained in this way.
Sorry, go on.
I just wanted to comment on two things that you guys said very quickly. You, Philip, you alluded to the idea that the multiverse interpretation is the most parsimonious because it requires the least mathematics. You just have one equation and that's it. You don't have that separate process of collapse or the many worlds. Yeah. Of course, I have thought about this, and I would try to illustrate how I feel about this with an analogy. Imagine you are a Ptolemaic astronomer, and you would say, well, my view of how the planets move is the most parsimonious because it only uses circles. And
Yeah.
never mind that there are circles and epicircles and circles of epicircles, and the thing explodes in untenable complexity, but you could still sit there and say, but it's only circles. I think what Shankaro is doing is to say, hey guys, it's only circles. Doesn't matter that the whole thing is absurd. It's only circles. Now, another quick comment. I used to, until a very short while ago, I'm very vexed by the fine-tuning problem. It makes me very uncomfortable. And until a very short time ago, I used to think in terms of this evolutionary black holes thing. I thought
Lee
as far out,
again. That's Lee Smolin again, isn't it?
I thought as far out as it is, it was the only thing that I could find that I thought, okay, there is some sense in this. But more recently, I'm more inclined now to think along the constructivist line being put forward by Marcus Miller and others, in which they say, look, there is something out there, but our view of the physical universe is constructed by induction. And induction even explains why we see the same thing, why we seem to measure the same thing. Now, if that's constructed by induction of our cognitive processes, then of course the constants will be fine-tuned because it has to account for our existence. It would happen sort of automatically. Now, I do not understand the mathematical details of that yet. It's heavy stuff. We have to make a bridge with constructivist foundations as well, which most physicists are not aware of, but there has been an attempt in philosophy for at least 100 years now to explain the world we perceive from a sort of third-person perspective out of first-person experience while avoiding solipsism. So we need to bridge that, but I see that as a potential way of tackling the fine-tuning, the vexing problem of fine-tuning.
That's really interesting. I hadn't heard of that approach.
Interesting. Okay, so I mean, I could talk about this all day because I really love foundational physics, and maybe we should get back to consciousness though, since allegedly.
Can I just one final thought just on this string?
Of course. Yeah.
So
sorry.
maybe I'm misunderstanding. I mean, the other thing is the Boltzmann brain. Maybe let's get into the Boltzmann brain worry, but there is that worry as well for the inflationary. But as I understood it, like. Okay, so according to string theory, that the constants we have depend on how the strings vibrate, but as I understood it, there's no empirical reason.
It depends on the geometrical structure of the
okay.
space that they're embedded in, which determines how.
But
they vibrate.
Is there any reason in physics to think that does vary in such a way that there are different constants in? I mean, it opens it up as a possibility. But is there any empirical grounds for thinking that possibility is actual?
You're talking about a realm in which possibility and actuality are the same thing. There is only probabilities at that level. So you ask the question, is there any positive reason to think it would happen? We can ask the question the other way around. Is there any positive reason to think it wouldn't? Because it's all probabilities anyway, and there is nothing outside of it that could impose a constraint. I mean, we know now, look, since this year, we know that at the foundational level, quantum mechanics is not deterministic. That's one of the winning essays of that prize I alluded to. So yeah, people realize that, you know, at the base level of reality, everything's a probability. So why not? Why not? If another universe is emerging, another cross-section of that brain, why wouldn't you throw the dice again? Yeah. Exactly. What would constrain it?
I mean, even if there's indeterminism and it's probabilistic, there's still laws that govern that and laws that have constants in them. And I think we'd need empirical reason to think that those constants change I mean, in a way, the inflationary universe is just a big universe. And I just like we'd need empirical reason to think in different parts of the observable universe that the numbers in physics are different. I think we'd need empirical grounds to think. Even if we understand from string theory how it could happen, I still think we'd need empirical reason to think that it does happen.
But Philip, there is empirical reason, because I take it. Oh, hello, dog.
It's a cat.
Oh, cat. Sorry.
How did you think that was a dog?
It's a cat.
I just saw the ear. It looked like a. Sorry. I love cats and dogs. But so we have empirical reason. So when you make a quantum measurement, there's a throw of a dice, right? There's randomness at that level. That's the indeterminism stuff that I think Bernardo's talking about. You can't deny that. So at that level, there's no fundamental law which determines which way it's going to come out. It's random. That's empirically confirmed.
For one thing, the Bohmian view doesn't have that feature, but
but
put
false.
that on one side. Put that on one side.
I mean,
okay,
it's not compatible with
it's
the empirical evidence that Bernardo was just bringing up.
It's probability within constraints. It's random.
What are the constraints?
Well, the
discrete nature of the variables.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not just like anything can happen.
It is because the constraints only apply if you run the event multiple times. But for one single row of that dice, there are no constraints. It can be anything.
Yeah, right.
Not absolutely anything, right? There's not.
Well, you can't measure the spin of an electron to be a cat, if that's what you're saying. It's going to be up or down. Right. So.
So there are constraints here, right? There are constraints. There's just because there's a certain amount of indeterminism, it doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. There are still constraints, and there are still these constants we observe to be wrapped absolutely solid in the universe we can observe. Since
I'm not sure the constants are the right way of getting at this, because that's just a mathematical trick. You can set them all to 1 if you really wanted to. But more, I mean, so, more interesting are like the parameters that have to be set.
You can call them parameters. There are certain parameters that
degrees of freedom that you have, etc. With it
that are fixed in the observable universe the universe we've observed. I think we'd need reason to think in these other bubble universes, those parameters are different to anything we've observed.
Guys, you are on a tear. Give me 30 seconds. I need to take a bio break. Continue on. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Okay.
No worries.
Yeah, no problem.
What? Just while Bernardo's wait, I would like to raise a couple of things about Bernardo's view in the next hour. So we maybe not go on with this too, but just what rules out the Bohmian view? What's the empirical evidence that rules out the Bohmian view?
This essay that Bernardo was talking about, which I'm not familiar with the details, but that realism is ruled out, that there are hidden variables is incompatible. I mean, I would say with just with the general nature of the things that we've discovered about quantum mechanics.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry on Bohmianism tells me, a lot of people talk about the contextualism and this ruling out the Bohmian view, and the Stanford Encyclopedia entry says this is just terrible objections. That nobody who really knows about this stuff would make them. So I mean, in some sense, I'm not a philosopher of physics. I kind of struggle with these things, but I'm not. I appreciate the Bohmian view isn't the fashion, but I'm not sure it has been ruled out empirically. But it's difficult to tell what is motivated by what theoretical physicists think are promising ways forward, and what has been ruled out. And yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the math gets here pretty technical, but so there are lots of predictions that have already been confirmed, and it's not clear that Bohmian mechanics gives the same results. In fact, no one's ever done the math, as far as I can tell. Seriously, no one's actually ever sat down and said, okay, according to the Bohmian mechanics, how do you reproduce the things that we already know are true about quantum mechanics? And to the limited extent that I've seen people try that, you get differences, empirical differences in what you would predict. And that's something that's not really addressed. I mean, I don't know. So I'm not sure.
Just remember the fact that the creator of that theory was not Bohm. It was de Broglie. And de Broglie himself rejected his own theory. So even the author of that theory admitted that, no, it's not tenable.
But there's a lot of pressure. Sean Carroll's talked quite well about how much pressure there was to accept the Copenhagen interpretation, and, real social pressure. So it's, Everett left academia, and, there was a lot of, sociological pressure to not even question the, apparently there was a famous proof of, oh, I can't remember the details now. What was it? The famous proof that was supposed to just show the Bohmian view was wrong, that everyone accepted for years, and then someone realized the main text of it, one of the pages was upside down, and nobody had noticed because no one read this thing. Anyway, sorry.
The most outspoken physicist against Bohmian mechanics today would be Ludwig Mottl, the Czech physicist. He's very outspoken about everything, including this. But I think he constructed the longest list of solid arguments against Bohmian mechanics. One thing we can mention immediately is that it doesn't have a relativistic extension like classical quantum mechanics has in quantum field theory. So until it has that, you can't even reconcile that with general relativity.
There's this guy Ward Stroiver who has papers.
Oh, that paper you sent, right? Yeah, there was an attempt to do that. Yeah.
But anyway, I mean,
most physicists today would say that would be a step back to try to make that work.
I agree. I appreciate it's not the fashion, but then I wonder whether that's because people aren't thinking hard enough about consciousness.
Well,
I don't know.
Well, anyway, so whether it had to do with consciousness or not, I don't know, but I'm more interested in the mathematics of it. And I've never seen a serious attempt to reproduce the results from the mathematics of that kind of theory. And Lubos, I don't know him personally, but I've read some stuff by his. He's, as far as I know, done some of the math and shown that there are empirical differences, actually. Yeah. He's not everybody's cup of tea. He's got a strong personality, to put it mildly, but he's very smart and he's very good at the math. And I haven't seen anything wrong with what he's done. So I don't know. So I don't know if that makes it right or wrong, but I'm more interested in the mathematical. So if your claim is that it reproduces all of the same stuff as quantum mechanics, then I want to see the math. I want to see the predictions, and I haven't seen it. And what I have seen suggests that there's some difficulties there. But anyway, so that's, but even more generally, so you were gone, Bernardo, but we were talking about the what is it, XQI, the essay that you were talking about?
Yeah, I keep forgetting the name.
That essay that you were lauding just now suggests that, so the way I was hearing what you were saying is that itself counts as evidence against the Bohmian interpretation, because
because everything would be indeterminate at that level. You could construe it that way, I think. I may be wrong about it, but I think you could construe it that way.
Okay. Yeah, I need to read that essay.
There are two winners. One of the authors is common to both. One is mostly about why the world is not deterministic at the foundational level, and the other one is why physics still has a lot to say despite that. It's a pair of essays, but neither is about this constructivist view of the objective world.
Right.
Some of the authors are involved with that other thing, but not the essays themselves.
Cool. Right. Okay. So, I mean, I like I said, I could talk about this all day because I love all this stuff. But I would like to sort of get us back on track to consciousness, because I noticed that's dropped out a little bit here. I do point out that I haven't heard Philip's response to the multiverse subject. So, if there is a multiverse, are there multiple cosmos subjects, or are they all?
I was going to say I don't, and I think Bernardo said the same thing. I mean, I don't think it really affects my view very much. I don't.
Well, my thought was that it pushes you more in Bernardo's direction.
Well, I mean, if you inflationary cosmology, you just have, in a sense, it's just one big universe, isn't it? With little pockets, little bubbles. I don't see why that. Why
but each bubble is a subject.
Well, so it's a difficult empirical question anyway. You know, which regions of the universe are also subjects in their own right. I tend to think, we should look to neuroscience to get the answers there. Whether we should say the bubbles, I don't know. I guess I haven't thought of that.
But it doesn't discriminate against your view either way, I think.
But you do need some account, I would say, of why the subjects are distinct if there are multiple subjects. And so this is going to sort of transition us maybe to talk about alters, because one of the main arguments I think that Bernardo has, which I would like to hear your response to, is this idea of dissociation and alters. So the way that I interpret Bernardo, and it's good that you're here so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I interpret him is that So if we're looking for something to do some explaining, we want to appeal to something that's empirically established, that's got some credentials behind it. And whatever you think about DID, there's some evidence there. I think you can interpret the evidence in different ways, and Bernardo and I have talked about that, and so that's fine. But still, there's that evidence. It is a psychologically known entity, so to speak. But fundamental laws, I mean, pushing everything into the base and then positing laws to sort of do your cleanup work does sort of sound a bit suspicious when you pit it up against something that's empirically got wheels like this does. So what is your response to that? And why don't you use the language of dissociation? What is it that you have against that way of thinking?
Yeah, so I initially thought in the article I wrote on Bernardo's stuff, I initially thought that he was taking dissociation to close the explanatory gap. So I thought, the idea was this gives us a completely intelligible explanation of how human conscious minds emerge. And my objection to that view that I thought was his was, I don't think this does close the explanatory gap, because I don't, just because if you just got one mind and certain subsets of its experiences become inferentially isolated from the others, that doesn't entail, it seems to me, the existence of another mind. And when I say another mind, I don't mean another fundamental mind or a mind that's wholly distinct from the original mind. I just mean it doesn't entail that they're on two conscious things when there were previously one. So that was my objection there. But then in our Twitter discussions, Bernardo was saying what you just said, Richard, that no, it's just that, look, we know that there is this empirical fact that one mind becomes two or becomes multiple minds, and so maybe we're thinking the most parsimonious explanation of human consciousness. Maybe that's it's a good grounds to go.
I mean,
in that
it's
direction.
Not really that there are two minds, is it, Bernardo? On your view, it's that there seems to be.
There seems to be, but the seeming is what needs to be explained.
Yeah. So I think that's really interesting and might have force. And two things. One, I still think we'd have to address how we satisfy those two constraints. I mean, that's sort of what I'm focused on. And I think I don't see, if this doesn't close the explanatory gap, then we've still got the question of, there's two things you need to do on, in a theory of consciousness. You need to work out what things are conscious and what things are not. So I don't think this answers the question, satisfying the two constraints. So we might still be back to the fundamental laws you don't like or whatever. But insofar as this is a guide to, which things are conscious and which things aren't, that might be one empirical pointer. Although, and I'm not opposed to it, although there are other considerations we might have to take into account. But what I was just thinking recently in preparing for this, for this discussion, I was trying to pin down what exact, and it relates to what has just been said actually. What exactly is it that is known empirically? And Bernardo knows much more about this stuff than I do. So it's not like I've got a definite view, but it seems like Bernardo wants to say the alters are, as he's just said, sort of in some sense maintain some kind of substantial identity or shared being with the mind they came from. But is that really what we know empirically? I mean, couldn't one argue that all we know empirically is just that at an earlier stage you've got one mind, and at a later stage you've got, in these cases of dissociation, in later case you've got multiple minds, and maybe it goes back to being one mind. And if that is just what we know empirically, it's not clear to me that pushes in favor of Bernardo's view, or not. So yeah, that's the sort of issue I would like clarification.
Can I comment?
Of course.
Sure, sorry, that was a bit long.
I think there is more to be said in favor of Philip's latest theory than he's saying himself. So I'll take the enormously arrogant step of trying to defend his view better than he just did. But before I get there, just to answer Philip's final question, what is it exactly that is empirically observed? Okay, we can answer that. We empirically observe that there is a illusion by what is fundamentally one mind, one person, that it is in fact many, and that the different seeming subminds have their own dispositions and their own memories and narratives of self, including names. So this is empirically observed clinically. It's also empirically observed in terms of neuroimaging that the brain processes of these people are different than those of actors pretending to themselves to have dissociative identity disorder. We also know empirically that there are things that are observed through neuroimaging that cannot be faked. For instance, this woman in Germany that had multiple alters, some of which were claimed to be blind, when one of those alters was in executive control of the body, activity in the visual cortex would disappear even though her eyes were open. Now you can't fake this. So we know that there is something real happening. We have no reason not to believe then the reports of these people that they speak from different centers of consciousness depending on the time. There is empirical evidence that the dreams of patients with dissociative identity disorder, and that's the work of a famous psychologist, Deidre, what was her name? Because I never remember her name, so I wrote it down here. Deidre Barrett from Harvard, work published already, first publication was already in the 90s. She shows that based on reports, that patients with DID, they experience their own dreams from multiple different perspectives. So they experience the same dream, but from the perspective of different characters or different avatars in the dream. And they report their experiences of the dream from that unique perspective, which sort of matches very well with our notion right now that we are experiencing the same world from different perspectives. It is also observed empirically that you can cure, you can cure DID, and the latest therapy that is gathering a lot of momentum because it seems to work is called Unification Therapy, I think is the name they're giving to this now. It's the latest therapy full of bells and whistles that has shown some empirical promising of dealing with the DID. And you can have a patient that has reunified reporting to you that he has or she has the memories of the individual alters, and now he or she recognizes those memories as his or her own. What we do not have, and I think that's what you're alluding to mostly, Philip, is a explicit, detailed explanation of how the process works. What is it exactly in our cognitive processes that leads to this seeming split? We know the split is illusory because it's only one mind at the end. You don't really believe that a person is fundamentally multiple. Well, maybe if you are a constitutive panpsychist, but you're not that anymore, Philip, so we don't need to go there. So what's missing is exactly what the mechanism is. And then I would defend your point of view now when you appeal to new fundamental laws of nature, which, like Richard, I also don't like, because it's like you're just pushing something else to the reduction base. You're not really explaining anything. But I would still defend that if I were in your shoes right now by saying, maybe since we don't understand dissociation fully, dissociation itself is a manifestation of this new law of nature that we don't yet understand, because we don't yet, we cannot reduce dissociation yet. So if we can't explicitly reduce it, although it's empirical, it may itself be a manifestation of a new regularity of nature that we haven't recognized yet.
Yeah, so I agree. These aren't clashing, and I'm not opposed to, you know, I think these are trying to do different things, and they are compatible. I mean, just two things quickly. One, I'm still clear. I'm sensing which it's an illusion. I mean, to my mind, if there's X and there's Y, and what it's like to be X is different to what it's like to be Y, then that's two subjects. But just, I mean, just suppose, for example, something like the integrated information theory, just to take, I don't know whether this, you know, might perfectly adequately explain why in cases of dissociation, you go from having one subject to having two subjects. Say it turned out that, you know, there is, in such cases, we go from one locus of maximal integrated information to two locus or multiple loci, is that the plural, of integrated maximal integrated information. And so we have an explanation of that. Just suppose, I mean, look, I'm not
You'd have to reject the exclusion postulate to do that.
Yeah, I know. Look,
pretty fundamental.
See, I'm not just, something like this. There was some theory of consciousness that predicted that in cases of dissociation, you go from, in case of dissociation, we go from conditions sufficient for one conscious mind to sufficient conditions for multiple conscious minds. Okay, and then it wouldn't seem to me to obviously imply anything about where my conscious mind came from. It's just, this theory predicts that in these situations we go from having one conscious mind to multiple conscious minds because the conditions necessary for consciousness go from being this conditions necessary for one conscious mind to multiple conscious minds. Why would that push us in the direction of, look, I ultimately share something like Bernardo's view, but I'm not clear why this pushes us in that direction. There's it's like the split brain cases as well. The split, I don't think the split brain cases push us to Bernardo's view. Why does dissociation push?
Well, if I may, I have a lot to say about IIT as well, but just to answer your question very quickly, there is nothing empirically showing us that subjects combine. There is nothing empirically showing us definitely that matter, as defined in physics, creates the qualities of experience. But here we have something staring us in the face in the empirical world that shows that some kind of decomposition of somebody who was born as one mind and then seemingly becomes many actually happens. Now, in your terminology, the seeming is already a different mind. I'm fine with that. If you say the seeming is alone to characterize the existence of multiple minds, I go along with you there. I don't have any problem with that. But it shows decomposition. And you might say, well, it also shows combination in the sense that it goes back to its original state. I would say, no, it just shows the reverse of decomposition.
I suppose I'm not
recomposition.
Sure. I might be wrong. I might be wrong about the. You know more about me. I suppose I'm not quite seeing. Does it really show decomposition, or does it just show that we go from having one mind to having multiple minds? Surely that is what we know empirically. Not that there's one mind that becomes multiple minds or that decomposes.
Yeah, but Philip, his point was that that we have some reason to take that seriously. I think because. Okay. After they've been integrated back into a unitary mind, they share the memories. So I thought that was the kind of point of that evidence that he was presenting.
Yeah, the person realizes, oh, it was me all along. It's the same thing that happens when you wake up from a dream. You are dissociated in your dream, in an ordinary dream, from the parts of your mind that are conjuring up the rest of the dream around your dream avatar. But you don't identify with that. You think that's, the cars, the streets, the trees around you in an ordinary dream. You think during the dream that they are not you. They are out there. You are dissociated from that part of you that's conjuring up all that stuff. But when you wake up, you realize, hey, it was me all along. I was imagining all that stuff.
It's a little bit different in the diachronic case, across time cases, I think. You just have one subject that sort of partially loses its memory for a bit. I think that's different to making sense of at one time multiple minds that are in some sense the same. I think that's more paradoxical. But just
but one time multiple.
I forgot what I was going to say now. Sorry.
During the dream, you have two minds during the dream at the same time. One mind generating the environment of the dream, the other mind being the character in the dream. And you don't have a sense of ownership of the cognitive processes generating that imagery. Actually, there are even certain brain damage circumstances in which people lose the ownership of their own memories. They still have their memories, but they don't think they are theirs. They think it's somebody else's memory. So dissociation expresses itself in all kinds of forms. And even conscious dissociation, there is clinical evidence for that. There is clinical evidence for alters fighting for executive control, which shows that they are both there concurrently,
Oh yeah. I'm not denying that there are conscious minds. I'm just, so just coming back to the point about them having the same memories. We have from Derek Parfit, all these, thought experiments where you might have, two minds fusing into one and the memories going into the next individual, and without needing to say that in some sense, I mean, he wants to say, we've got two minds, and then there's a brand new mind, but that it inherits the memories, and he's got all sorts of thought experiments in that regard. So it's not. I mean, I'm not opposed to this, but it's not completely obvious to me just because when the dissociation ends, the mind that is there then has the memories of the previous minds. It doesn't seem to be obvious that they have any substantial identity with it.
Well, but they say that they come to a realization that they were the ones, that they're their memories. It's not just that they have them. It's like, oh, that was me. I think that's kind of the crux of that.
And the thought is we should trust their testimony on that. Is that the?
But what else do you have?
Yeah. I'm not saying I'm opposed to that, but
I mean, I have private, personal experience with mild forms of dissociation, not DID, but I have come to insights later in life that, for instance, there was a moment I suddenly realized that there was something I was thinking and feeling for years, but I was not explicitly aware of it. There was a part of me that thought and felt in a certain way constantly, all the time, in parallel to what I knew I thought and felt. And then when you reintegrate them, you realize, darn, I was too. That was me, and that was me as well. Right. And I just didn't have any cognitive bridges between the two. And I can tell you, it's a very compelling experience, the realization that both were you all along. And then I would say, well, is that in a definitional sense really the foundational mind behind the two, or did we have actually two separate minds that now have become only one mind that inherited the memories of the two? I mean, you talk a lot about it in your latest paper. What's the distinction there? Yeah, I understand the conceptual validity of the discussion, but when it comes down to, my sense of reality, my sense of what happened, there's a little doubt. Both were me, the same guy I am now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose, so as I say, I mean, I'm not opposed to this possibility. I suppose it's just, I mean, if this closed the explanatory gap, I'd say, wow, this is the right theory, because that would be amazing. But it seems to be kind of one empirical consideration. And if it turned out that, a theory, global workspace theory, whatever, predicted that, well, I'm kind of repeating myself now, that we go from one mind to two, then it's not. And I suppose the other thing, finally, and I won't push this anymore, is just, I suppose I have conceptual difficulty. This is where we ended our Twitter discussion a while. Conceptual difficulty, in what sense it's, you want to say that they're still in some sense not distinct from the mind they came from, but they are distinct. I mean, I suppose either I want to say either what it's like to be the new thing is different to what it's like to be the old thing, and then they're just different subjects, or that's not the case and they're the same. I have conceptual difficulty making sense of this middle way between identity and distinctness of subjects. That might be another part of the.
If I can quickly comment on that and just go back to one thing I wanted to say before regarding IIT, you reminded me now. What would be the conceptual reason to imagine the alters as all along being the same mind? I would refer you to Ite, our friend Ite Shani's paper from 2015, his paper on Cosmopsychism, where he talks about core subjectivity and sentience being inherited by every relative subject, his terminology for alters or individual subjects. It's complex to go into that discussion right now, but I would just refer you to that.
I have difficulty making sense of that as well.
Core subjectivity.
Yeah, I remember you saying that in Twitter, but yeah.
Core subjectivity makes all kinds of sense to me personally on an introspective basis. It's like, it's a flashing, glaring light, like Ite pinned it. He really pinned it. But it's difficult to convey that conceptually. But regarding IIT, IIT, of course, is not an ontology. It's not making any metaphysical claims. It's just finding a correlation between reported experience and certain loop-like patterns of brain activity that integrate information. I would just alert you to the implication of the methodology involved in deriving IIT. What they are finding correlates off is not phenomenal consciousness, it is meta-consciousness, because the entire methodology is based on reportability. The subject has to report, so the subject has not only to have the experience, it has to be explicitly aware, introspectively, of having the experience. And there is a whole stream of neuroscience now, the no-report paradigm, as they call it now, in which people have become aware that of this distinction, that there may be non-reportable phenomenal experience, and then the neurocorrelates of that can be completely different. So I would bring your attention to that in your write-up, the latest. You go from explicitly explaining that you're talking about phenomenal consciousness, and then you go seamlessly into IIT, which implicitly conveys a message that IIT is figuring out what the correlates of phenomenal consciousness are. But that's not the case. It's a subset of that. It's the correlates of metacognitive awareness.
Yeah, so I mean, just on that, the use of IIT in my paper and the use of IIT in this discussion today was purely illustrative. You know, I'm not a proponent of IIT. I mean, it gives you a nice sort of simple theory of the correlates that you can talk about for examples, but I'm not, and I appreciate there are those issues. I mean, Richard's written nice papers. I've been reading your papers with Hakwan on, yeah, these issues of oh, you know, are we tracking, you know, well, just, I mean, just the issue you said about non-reportable consciousness, or the disagreements with Ned Block and Richard on this guy, and I have no idea where I sell. I find that issue very difficult, but I agree that the proponents of IIT haven't defended their side of that position enough. But yeah, but I'm not.
I mean, don't tell Giulio that his view doesn't make any ontological commitment, that it's a view about metacognition, because I'm sure he denies that.
Well, they say there's an identity, don't they? They say there's an identity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
does he deny? I mean, does he deny that his views don't make an ontological commitment?
He wants to identify phenomenal consciousness with these integrated information facts,
conceptual structures,
which makes it just like physicalism. I mean, I've just Christoph Koch and me reviewed each other's recent books, and yeah, this is the claim I was making. You know, it's a sort of reductive physicalism, strictly speaking.
Because Christoph himself does not make the claim. Christoph is a dual aspect monist.
Well,
a panpsychist even.
He might, maybe he contradicts himself, but he does assert that identity.
But it's an identity between the conceptual, the mix, as they call it, or they used to call it. But that's not something physical. That's something else. Maybe implemented in physical systems. But
yeah, that's what Christoph says in his book.
Yeah, that's Giulio's view too. I mean, they're open to the panpsychists because they think logic gates and anything with the integrated information is going to have consciousness. So it's not exactly exactly. And internet. Anything with a measurable phi. I mean, my problem is that you can't compute phi. It's mathematically intractable. Anyway, so
can I
would just
raise
plug
another
one theory which hasn't been.
Sorry.
That's a higher order theory. They can make sense of a lot of these data points as well with respect to dissociation, et cetera. But so Philip, I want to let you have your say, but I want you to convince us that there's some other alternative to disassociation for explaining the relationship between our consciousness and the universal consciousness.
I do want to raise one other issue with Bernardo's work that I'm really keen to talk about before we finish. Oh. But no, look, I mean, it depends what you're trying to do. So I see it as, two tasks here. One is we have to work out what's the best theory of which things are conscious and which things aren't conscious. Mapping correlations. And the empirical data about dissociation might be an important factor there. I suppose that's the way of putting it. I'm not seeing why it's more than just a correlation. I think what we can get at empirically are correlations, and so I would want to say okay, what we know empirically is you've got one conscious mind, you've got multiple, you've got right, and I think that might be more pared down than the metaphysical claims Bernardo wants to attribute to, but it's interesting what you're saying about maybe trusting people's testimony that's a really interesting thought actually, because I suppose I'm thinking all we have to go on is observing people's brains and asking them how they're feeling. But maybe if we can trust the testimony that they've sort of become a reunified person, maybe that's another form of testimony that can help us there. So that's really interesting. I have to think more about that. So that's one thing. And I guess I just don't really have a novel contribution there. I'm really interested in the task, and I read your papers, Richard, and other, and try and get a grip on it. But I suppose what the task I'm interested in, which is just a different task, is closing the explanatory gap and in an empirically adequate way. And so it's just a sort of different task that. But what
explanatory gap do you see that's not being closed? By the way, Bernardo is addressing this issue.
I don't think it closes the explanatory gap because I think if you've got one mind and certain of its phenomenal properties become inferentially isolated from the others, I don't think that entails that there are now two subjects, even in the minimal sense that there are, there's X and there's Y, and what it's like to be X is different to what it's like to be Y. I don't think it entails that. So it doesn't close the explanatory gap.
You're replacing one explanation for the empirical fact. You're saying inferential isolation is one way of explaining the empirical fact of dissociation. But what Richard is saying is, forget that. Pretend that we don't have an explanation, a conceptual explanation for dissociation, but we know that it happens. Isn't that pointing the way amongst the three alternatives, either emergence, combination, or decomposition? Isn't it pointing an empirical preference towards one of the three?
Possibly. Yeah, possibly. It's something in the mix. But I thought Richard was asking me what is the explanatory gap left over, and I think maybe Bernardo's agreeing. I'm not sure when you say there's no conceptual explanation of it. I suppose that is to say the explanatory gap isn't closed. So that's that's all I'm saying. I'm not.
I will agree with you. We do not have a final conceptual explanation for dissociation, strong dissociation. We just don't have it. I think inferential isolation is one. I think obfuscation through attention is another. I think you can add all of this together and it's still not fully conceptually satisfactory. So I would grant that there is an explanatory gap in the sense of making conceptual sense of dissociation. But that's a minor point compared to the big explanatory gap that plagues an ontological choice, which sort of assumes that there aren't empirical instances of any of the things postulated, combination, emergence, or decomposition. But if you say empirically there is decomposition, we may not be able to explain exactly how it happens, but we know that it happens, then you are in a completely different reality than the original reality of the explanatory problem, in which you are purely still in the world of plausibility, coherence. Here you are beyond coherence, you are beyond plausibility. You know that it exists. It's a matter of whether we human beings can make conceptual sense of it. Wouldn't you grant that this is a whole other discussion than the abstract discussion that preceded it?
Well, I just think they're two different things. You seem to be saying it partially closes the explanatory gap. I don't think it closes the explanatory gap at all, any more than, I hope we don't have an argument now, any more than physicalism or certain forms of panpsychism. Or if there's an explanatory gap, there's an explanatory gap. I don't think it's sort of it's like being, you're either pregnant or you're not. I think there's either an explanatory gap closed or there isn't. And I don't think it closes the explanatory gap, which is not to say that it might. I'm open to the other point that it gives us empirical reason to maybe, have some kind of worldview where there's big minds turning into little minds, maybe. But
it is your view right now.
Yeah, which is my view, exactly right. But I have that view because I think there's this way of closing the explanatory gap in an empirically adequate way. But I don't.
You prefer postulating new laws of nature than to empirically appeal to something we know exists.
I guess I'm now inclined to think, for various reasons, that every form of consciousness, including human consciousness, is in some sense irreducible. And so you're gonna have to postulate basic laws.
But
And then
you
the
think
question is, how do you, yeah.
You think that adding something to the reduction base is better at closing the explanatory gap than appealing to empirical observations that are nearly irrefutable? How do you
But I don't
close
think they
this
do. But I don't think they do close the explanatory gap. I don't think they do close the explanatory gap. I agree. They might give us reason to think big minds
how do you
turn into
close?
small minds.
How do you close the explanatory gap?
The way the dualist does, by postulating basic laws of nature. And if it is the case that all forms of consciousness are irreducible, I think it looks like that's how you've got to do it. And you might say,
but is that really more satisfying to you as an explanation, to shove something into the reduction base? In other words, basically not explaining it at all, just saying it's a brute fact. Is that explanatorily more satisfying to you than pointing to an empirical process we know to exist?
It would be, I mean, it would be better, I guess, if you didn't have to appeal to extra laws of nature. But I don't think what you're offering gives us that alternative. I just don't think it makes any advancement on that specific issue of closing the explanatory gap, as opposed to, the issue of which things are conscious, which things are not. So I don't think there's an alternative, and I don't think I don't see why. I think there's good principled reasons to think we're gonna have to bridge this gap with basic laws.
But is that an explanation to postulate brute facts of nature? Is that an explanation, or is it precisely the avoidance of the need for an explanation? Because you're not reducing anything. You're just saying, well, it happens. It's a brute fact. Done.
Yeah,
I'm
it
done
puts you
with
on all fours with the physicalist in a way that I don't think Bernardo's view is, because the physicalist is going to have to sort of, a type B materialist is going to appeal to some brute identity between brain states and conscious experiences. Now you're appealing to some brute fact, some law that connects brain states to conscious experiences. It's exactly the same parallel move. So if one is dissatisfactory, so is the other.
Well, I mean, I think there are strong arguments against type B, the type of identity the type B physicalist wants to make. I mean, we could get into that. I think I don't agree with that. I think if type B physicalism did work out, it would be very satisfying, because in a way it's not brute, it's just like water and H2O as they think about it. But I mean, I don't think that view does work out, but I think it would be satisfying if it did. Look, what's I'm postulating? I mean, there's plenty of precedent, as David Chalmers has pointed out, there's plenty of precedent in science for non-reductive explanations. When Maxwell explains electromagnetism, he doesn't explain it in terms of what goes on before. He postulates new electromagnetic properties and laws and explains on that basis. I mean, every scientific theory postulates fundamentals. The explanation has to end somewhere. Postulates laws. Okay, usually the laws are causal laws, sort of diachronic from past to future, whereas in this case they're sort of synchronic from the lower level to the high level. But I don't see why that means they're completely inadequate. And as I say, if human consciousness is fundamental, I think that's what we're going to have to do.
But I don't think the claim is that it's completely inadequate, because yes, we have to come down to some fundamentals at the end of the day. You can't keep on explaining one thing in terms of another forever. But the point is a relative comparison between the two concrete options in front of us. One is, you say, well, the formation of individual subjects is a brute fact. In other words, you're not really explaining anything. You're adding a brute fact to the reduction base.
It's a non-reductive explanation. But yeah, go on.
But then you say that is more explanatorily satisfactory, although you're not really explaining, in the sense that you're not really reducing it. You say it's more explanatorily satisfactory than to point to a known empirical fact, while acknowledging that we may not have a complete conceptual understanding of the processes underlying that empirical fact. But you prefer to add a brute fact. It gives you more explanatory satisfaction to add a brute fact than to follow nature. That I find very striking.
If you had a way of closing the explanatory gap without recourse to fundamental laws, that would be better, and I would embrace it wholeheartedly. I don't think that, as you're agreeing, I don't think that is what you're offering. And I don't agree that what we have empirical reason to think that there is a way of closing the explanatory gap in this vicinity. As you say, even if so I'm accepting that there might be empirical reason to think, you know, big minds turn into little minds, but of course my theory has an explanation of that as well. So even if, so I do agree, possibly I'm very much open to the idea that there's an empirical reason to think that big minds become little minds, and that's sort of how it fundamentally works. But I don't think there's any empirical reason to think there's a way of closing the explanatory gap in this vicinity. So I'd embrace it if that was what you were offering, or if there was some hint that there was one here. But that I don't agree.
But you claim that that's what you are offering. It's right there in your paper. You claim that you are closing the explanatory gap by postulating brute facts. So if that is a closure of the explanatory gap, I would say dissociation is a much better way to close it. I mean, if postulating a brute fact is closing the explanatory gap, what else is not?
I mean, when a scientist, you know, explains something by postulating the Schrödinger equation and explains, you know, the evolutionary, you don't say, oh, you've just postulated, you haven't explained why the Schrödinger equation, but you know, everyone has to stop. So it's, look, I agree. It would be better it would be more parsimonious if we could do it without these extra laws. Of course, that would be more parsimonious, but I can't see that you've offered us that way of doing that, or given us reason to think there is a way of doing that in this vicinity.
This is an important point because I'm getting lost on the dialectic here. So we keep using the explanatory gap with the definite article there, and so it seems to me like you are. So Philip, are you suggesting that Bernardo's view is left with the original, the normal one that we all talk about? You know. How do you get from these physical facts to a conscious experience? Is that so? You must mean a physical. You must mean a explanatory gap, an explanatory gap, because it's not the explanatory gap.
What we mean by an explanatory gap is you've got a story about X emerging from Y, and you don't have an explanation of how that happens. Or I mean, I would ultimately put it in terms of a priori entailment, that you can't move a priori from the more fundamental thing to the less fundamental thing. I think the physicalist faces an explanatory gap. I think the panpsychist can face an explanatory gap. It's not the same explanatory gap because you're not going from the physical, you're going from conscious particles to systems level consciousness, but there still seems an explanatory gap there in that, you know, there's no intelligible explanation. And I think Bernardo faces exactly the same explanatory gap, that there's no explanation of how one conscious mind can become
exactly the same kind of explanatory gap. The same kind of explanatory gap, not because what Richard is hinting at, it's not the physicalist explanatory gap, it's another one, but you're saying it's equivalent in some sense.
It's not, obviously you're not going from physical facts to consciousness facts, but I think it's just as troubling insofar as we're going from base to product.
But don't you get the same thing, Philip? Because you can't a priori deduce from the cosmopsychist without adding these fundamental laws. So if the ideal reasoner would have to postulate the existence of these things, so there's no entailment from the cosmopsychic facts to the your consciousness facts without the addition of these brute facts. So it's the same, you get the same gap. You're just trying to plug it with a kind of ad hoc maneuver, postulating some bridge between them.
Once you plug in the laws, you do have an explanation, right? And you might say,
but it's arbitrary.
Satisfy. Well, I don't see why that's any more arbitrary than explaining, you know, a causal process in terms of the Schrödinger equation.
Of course not. I mean,
you haven't explained the Schrödinger.
If we look at science, you have to look at the entire history of science, not only particular moments. We have reduced everything to 4 fundamental laws, and we are very close to reducing those 4 laws, which in fact are 4 feuds, to 1 feud. I mean, the history of science is the history of reduction, and we have been extraordinarily successful at that. Because of quantum field theory, we can explain Maxwell's equations. We can reduce them, not in a way that Maxwell was aware of at the time, but today we have reduced it. So it's not the history of science that you postulate ad hoc brute facts to make sense of everything. It's on the contrary.
That's a loaded way of putting it, ad hoc brute facts. Of course, we try to get them as simple as possible. You want them, who was it who said, to be written on a t-shirt? But I mean, one problem with appealing to history of science is, I think, you know, the history of science since Galileo hasn't been really dealing with conscious, or, you know, the physics at least. And so it's not obvious what lessons we can draw from there. But look, I mean, I would reject that it's ad hoc. it would be more, look, what you can say is it would be more parsimonious if you had fewer laws, right? That you can say that, but I don't see why it's,
But you have to cherry pick,
and
you have to cherry pick the laws too.
And I think we have good reason to think human consciousness is fundamental. So we're going to have to, I think that's a good reason to think we're going to have to bridge the gap with laws. Sorry, Richard. What do you mean cherry pick the laws?
Well, there's an infinite number of laws that connect these states to conscious experiences. So you have to select the right ones out of all of these sort of ones. That's why it's
an
ad hoc.
infinite number. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I mean,
so that's.
But it's an no, hold on. It's an empirical question. We look. What we try and work out is the best.
That's why it's not a priori. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the same gap.
Exactly.
You've lost me a bit now. What I take it, what you have to do is you look to neuroscience, the correlations that neuroscience gives, and dissociation might be something that comes in there, and then we try to get the best systematization of that. I mean,
but you're comparing it to ideals. I'm trying to make a comparison between the two. We are both facing the same problem, which is how do we come from a universal consciousness to individual private consciousnesses? How do we make that step? I say, well, we can get a clue from nature, from an empirical process we know to exist. It's called dissociation. And although we don't have a full conceptual understanding of it, we have some. And regardless of that, we know it happens. So let's look for an explanation along those lines. And you're taking the exact same problem and you're saying, well, it's a brute fact that individual subjects form. Point. You don't go any further than that. And you say that this is explanatorily more satisfactory than what I'm doing. That is what I find extraordinary.
Well, we might go around in circles a bit, but sometimes you seem to be saying this partially closes the explanatory gap, and when you say we don't have a full conceptual explanation, I mean, I'm not sure what exactly it means. I prefer to talk about, a priori entailment, and I don't think this offers any closing of the explanatory gap any more than the physicalist or the simpler forms of panpsychism, and nor do I think there's empirical grounds to think there is a way of closing the explanatory gap in this vicinity. So if you could do it without appealing to extra laws, I'd say that's more parsimonious. Great, but I don't accept that there.
But you're putting conceptual understanding above empirical fact. You're saying it doesn't matter that there is an empirical fact that this happens. If I can't have a complete conceptual understanding of it, I will ignore it, and that's armchair philosophizing. Nature is telling you the solution. Why wouldn't you look at it?
What the empirical facts are telling us, if you're right, is that there's empirical grounds to think little minds come from big minds, and that's what fundamentally goes on. I'm happy with that. I'm not rejecting what the empirical facts point to. I'm just not seeing a solution to the explanatory gap, and so much as I'd love to embrace.
But the explanatory gap loses a lot in significance. Once you can point to nature and say, look, even if I can't explain exactly how it happens, I know that it happens. And now it becomes a question of elaborating conceptually on our understanding of it. But everything can go on based on the observation that it does happen. It's not a question of plausibility anymore. It happens, all right? It's there.
Can I try to step in here, because I do think that we're chasing our tail a bit. Here's a way maybe to put the points. So everybody, for the sake of argument, at least, I'm a bit of a skeptic, but still, everyone for the sake of argument is accepting DID as a psychologically real phenomenon. Philip seems to be arguing that even when you have that in place, you still have the explanatory gap. Whereas what I hear Bernardo arguing is that by extension of psychiatric theories that we already know, that we can sort of see a road between where we are now and a complete understanding of dissociation.
There is a path in principle,
Right, and so that's where the explanatory. Right, so where, Philip, do you not see the extension?
That's just what I'm not saying. I'm not seeing a pathway to closing the explanatory gap. I mean, I just really don't see the difference. I hope this isn't offensive. I really don't see the difference between a physicalist saying, we know that it happens. One day we'll find the way to bridge the explanatory gap. I mean, perhaps I can be persuaded. Perhaps I can be persuaded that yes, you're right. We know that it happens. I'm still.
We don't
a
know
little
that
bit
it happens under physicalism. We don't know that it happens.
Okay. But let's say, but let's say, you know, even if a physicalist could say, look, we know when you get these kind of brain states, you get consciousness. You know, even if you had
that's
that,
correlation, not causation.
It's more equivalent to like Newton, right? It's more equivalent to Newton saying, look, we know that gravity happens. We don't know how it happens. And then we get Einstein's curvature of space. Exactly. And we can see a kind of connection, how you get from one to the other. Of course, Newton couldn't have seen it, but we see how you get there. So why isn't it sort of similar in this respect here?
I mean, even with, you know, when we get to Einstein, we still, you know, you always end up with certain facts that are brute, that, you know, that matter follows geodesics through space-time, and space-time curvature impacts on that, you know, so in a way, you know, we always have to get to these brute explanations. Why is it different? Because yeah, I just don't see the reason to think that this is pointing us to a way of closing explanatory gap. Even if you're right that it happens, that we have one mind becoming two, that could be, you know, it could be because of brute laws of nature. I don't see a pathway. I don't see a pathway to giving an intelligible explanation of that. And in fact, I think there are good arguments that you know, human consciousness is fundamental, so you can't really give that kind of reductive explanation.
I don't think we're going to converge, and we are very close to the time you have to leave. But
I mean, it might be, if just make a concessionary point here. I mean, kind of concessionary. It might be to do with you liking the Itay-Shani stuff, and I suppose it, you know, it might be something to do with that, this making sense of this middle way between separate and distinct minds, and maybe if I was into that would help to see how the explanatory gap could potentially be closed. So it might, I don't know.
You face the same problems, but I also want to make a concessionary point. I concede to you that dissociation may be an expression of fundamental laws. Do I think we have reason to believe that right now? I don't think we do. I think we have lots of very promising, understandable, coherent ways to make sense of it based on standard psychological and psychiatric doctrine. We have lots of hints related to inferential isolation, related to attention, to focus. So, but I concede that ultimately it might be the case that there is a fundamental law in operation. And I know we are not going to agree today, but there is only one point that I really want to highlight, because you suggested it, and I'm totally in opposition to that, which is, it is an empirical fact that one mind thinks of itself as being many, but it is not an empirical fact that matter creates experiential states. The empirical fact is that there is a correlation between the two. There is no empirical fact of experience creation or arising out of material organization. It's not an empirical fact. It's a theoretical inference based on the empirical fact of correlation. But one mind becoming many, whether it is an illusion or not, is irrelevant for the point in contention, because all that is required is the illusion. If you show that the illusion happens, you are done. It is an empirical fact. It does not depend on interpretation.
I'm gonna have to go in a few minutes. I mean, I'm not sure about this illusion stuff, or one mind thinking it's many, or, I mean, yeah, it could be that there's empirical evidence that one mind becomes many, but I don't think we're getting anything here that in any way closes the explanatory gap. But the other thing I wanted to talk about that, but we're not going to have time, but is, why I think the manifest state, the alter manifests as the body rather than the brain. But we'll have to
have a third session for that. Another session.
Anyway, I got to.
I mean, so but can you give us just a quick? I know you have to go, but can you give us a 30-second argument that there's an explanatory gap here?
That there's an explanatory gap.
That even if you knew all the facts about dissociation, there would still be this further question about the relationship.
I don't see, it's the same gap you have in any case, in every case. There's not, just because you've got certain quantitative physical properties, it doesn't entail qualitative consciousness properties. Just because you've got conscious particles doesn't entail that the system is conscious. Just because you've got one mind with certain subset of its experiences cognitively isolated doesn't inferentially isolate. It doesn't entail that you've got two conscious things in any sense, even in the minimal sense that there's now two conscious things, that what it's like to be one is different. So it's just as much an explanatory gap. And then you say, okay, well, how do I know that, if we keep doing this, we'll close the explanatory gap? I mean, look, I'm open to people working on that. That would be great. But I'm also in some way open to physicalists. As you say, it's the type C physicalist position. Maybe we'll close the explanatory gap but in either case, and I'm not saying to be provocative comparing to physicalism. Honestly, in either case, I don't see any reason to think there's a way of closing the explanatory gap. I mean, I give some credence to all these possibilities, but
you claim to have closed it in your latest paper by postulating a brute fact.
Yeah, I mean, anyone can close it in that way.
Yeah,
right?
That's the point. That's exactly the point.
The challenge. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if that would be consistent with the definition of physicalism, but
it is.
The challenge is closing it that way in a way that's empirically adequate. That's how I see the challenge. But yeah.
All right. Well, we gotta let Philip go because
anyway.
Yeah, you've got I know you got real life. I just heard my children waking up from their naps, so that means my time is kaput as well. I want to thank both of you guys for joining me. This was a really great discussion. I feel like we have a lot more to talk about. We covered a lot. There's still a lot left to cover. So thanks, guys. Let me go ahead and end this, and I'll say bye off the air just really quickly.
That was really
good. Thanks a lot. It was a lot of fun. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
All
right, we're clear, guys. We're clear.